Hey, my name is Jori Grym from the Hanken School of Economics in Helsinki. And in this first module, we're going to talk about the history of customer behavior sciences and psychology in general. There's a rich and vast history of psychology and social sciences in general, and other sciences of the mind as well. And we're going to focus on what led us here in this course, which means we're going to focus on Western philosophy, Western psychology, and how psychology relates to marketing sciences, business sciences, and consumer sciences. This entails the history of psychology through philosophy, but also the birth of social psychology and behavioral economics. When we talk about the history of modern psychology, we usually start from ancient Greece. We'll start with Plato, who back in 387 BC suggested that the brain is a mechanism of mental processes. So Plato suggested that the brain is a mechanism of different mental processes. And Plato, of course, was the student of Socrates. And a couple of years later, in 335 BC, Aristotle suggested that the heart is the mechanism of mental processes. He, of course, was a student of Plato's. So they both agreed that thinking and behavior are some sort of mechanism of mental processes, but they didn't really know how to locate them. Both are, of course, known for their contributions to philosophy. Plato wrote the Republic, and the concept of Aristotelian ethics is something we're going to come back to on our module on ethics. So the ancient Greek philosophers gave the foundation of thinking about thinking and thinking about the mind that went on to give the foundation to modern psychology as well. We're going to skip through the Middle Ages because the rich history would take us hours and hours and end to go through. And also, when you think about modern psychology and modern behavior sciences, the religion-based philosophies that happened in the Middle Ages did have some thoughts about thinking and thoughts about mental illnesses and those kinds of things, but they were so tied up in superstitions and religious history and religious obedience that a systematic review of the scientific findings of that age would take forever at this point. And it wouldn't yield us so much knowledge for where we are today. So let's skip to the 16th century, where philosophy is generally regarded as the later part of the Renaissance philosophy. And we start seeing the first inklings of the Enlightenment. During the Renaissance, the old Aristotelian and Platonic principles were dug up and they were started to be discussed more widely. Then the major turning point might be what we call the Age of Reason, also known as the Enlightenment. And that established an authoritative system of ethics, aesthetics, and knowledge that solidified the scientific method. And that is where we basically start our story. I might add that The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was published in 1776, which gave rise to economics. And from here, we start seeing real advances in psychology and economics. In 1834, Ernst Heinrich Weber published his perception theory of just noticeable differences, also known as Weber's law. This is notable because we're going to see this principle play in actions when we talk about perceptions later on. In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, detailing his view on evolution and expanding the theory of survival of the fittest. And this is a seminal work which we will talk about when we talk about evolutionary psychology. 1879, Wilhelm Wundt founded his formal laboratory of psychology at the University of Leipzig, marking the formal beginning of the study of human emotions, behavior, and cognitions. So 1879 was technically the first formal laboratory that used the word psychology in its studies. So that's one of the main beginnings of modern psychology as well. Wundt developed the school of structuralism, which looked at the elements of consciousness. He started to teach the different structural parts of consciousness like emotions, thoughts, etc. His point was to separate the objectivity of sensations and the outside world from the subjectivity of feelings or reactions, for example. And that school of thought was called structuralism. And a couple of years later, in 1883, the first laboratory of psychology in America is established at Johns Hopkins University. So that marks the beginning of American psychology. A couple of years after that, in 1886, Sigmund Freud began performing therapy in Vienna, marking the beginning of personality theory. He founded, of course, psychoanalysis and pioneered talking therapy in general. He gave basis to the psychodynamic thinking, where most of the thinking is assumed to happen in the unconscious part of the mind, and it's rife with conflicts between urges, wishes, and impulses, etc. These days, Freudian psychology is a bit old-fashioned, but he's still the one who came up with the modern idea we have about the conscious and unconscious mind. And even though we read about him a lot and joke about him a lot, this is his main contribution, I think, to the ways we think about modern psychology. And a bit after that, in 1890, William James published Principles of Psychology that later became the foundations for functionalism. And this is one of the major schools of thought at the time. Because functionalism explores how mental processes help an organism to thrive and adapt to its surroundings and function in the world, basically. So he added something that Darwin brought to the table and the psychological ideas that Sigmund Freud and others had been, and start thinking about it more practically. So William James was one of the pivotal teachers of psychology in 1890. The same year, 1890, New York State passed the State Care Act, ordering mentally ill patients out of poorhouses and into state hospitals for treatment. And that gave rise to the development of first institutions in the US for psychiatric research and treatment. So that was a big practical turning point in history. Just a couple of years after that, in 1892, was the foundation of the American Psychological Association, the APA. And all students know what APA stands for. It's the format that you use in citations in many papers. So that's where it comes from. Some years after that, in 1898, Norman Triplett wrote what is now recognized as the first published study in the field of social psychology. His experiment was on social facilitation effect. So 1898, we see the first time that social psychology is starting to branch out as its own unique form of psychology. And marketing psychology and consumer research and consumer behavior psychology, in my opinion, is much more based on social psychology than psychotherapy or psychology or clinical psychology or even cognitive psychology. Now we turn to the 20th century, and in 1906, Ivan Pavlov published the first studies on classing and conditioning. We all know Pavlov's classical conditioning in some way, and this is something we're going to come back to in later modules as well. Just 2 years after that, William McDougall published the first textbook on social psychology. So we start seeing social psychology raising its head in the beginning of the century. In 1913, John B. Watson published Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It. That marked the beginning of behavioral psychology. And behavioral psychology was focused on observable empiric behavior and not speculation on what lies within the brain. So behaviorists strictly cataloged and watched behavior and said that outside forces and historical events are what shape the behavior in the future and not so much deep processes that go inside the brain. In the same year that Watson published his Psychology as Behaviorist Views, Carl G. Jung departed from Freudian views and developed his own theories, citing Freud's inability to acknowledge religion and spirituality. His new school of thought became known as analytical psychology. So psychoanalysis was Freud's thing, and analytical psychology was Carl Jung's. Jung's theories might, in today's psychology, look a bit woo-woo at parts, but he did give us depth psychology and the idea of archetypes. These primary modules we kind of build our worldview with and are born with. Archetypes are used much in marketing strategy research, and even though there's not a lot of empirical data backing up his ideas, it's a good way of thinking about how we structure the world. In 1919, Max Wertheimer began the formal founding of Gestalt psychology as he began experiments on the five phenomenon. And Gestalt psychology is something we're going to come back to when we talk about perception. Now we come to the part that really gave rise to much of consumer research, much of social psychology, and much of marketing research, which is world wars, especially World War II. So the Second World War gave birth and boosted a lot of scientific thinking in psychology. Lots of clinical psychology and psychiatry, because there was so much trauma involved and mental distress during the war. And then behavioral sciences like social psychology started studying conformity, cruelness, blind obedience, prejudice, and in-group, out-group thinking, which was so prevalent during the wars. But it also gave rise to marketing strategies through propaganda. So propaganda was a communication tool that was rigorously studied to see how it affects citizens and enemies and other states as well. So the World War gave us that as well. So the Second World War gave us a lot of bodies and a lot of sorrow and a lot of atrocities, but also boosted a lot of these sciences as well. There was also a big boom of industrialization after the Second World War when we started rebuilding Europe and America started to be the powerhouse of industry. This gave rise to consumerism when everybody wanted the 1950s American dream, which was partly built by the marketers and partly available because of the economic rise that happened. So all of a sudden, especially in America, people started affording more than just necessities. So people wanted luxury, new cars, all the glamour and pastel-colored equipment you see in old movies and all the 50s things. So science and industry started working together to build consumer research and consumer sciences as well as marketing sciences. Another cornerstone of psychology comes in 1952 when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder was released. The DSM, as it's called, catalogs all the diagnoses and symptoms of mental disorders that psychiatrists and clinical psychologists use to help their patients. The DSM is now on its 5th print, and every time they make a new DSM, some diagnoses are taken out, like homosexuality as a disease, and new diagnoses are put in, like ADHD. So we'll see which diagnoses are taken out and which new diagnoses are created when the DSM-6 comes around. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the same year, 1952, that Thorazine was first introduced and used to treat schizophrenia. So we start seeing diagnostic tools and treatments that start to use real hard science and evidence-based medicine to treat mental illness as well. And the year after that, in 1853, another prominent person in psychology, B.F. Skinner, outlined behavioral therapy, lending support to behavioral psychology via research in the literature. So this is the other heavy hitter in the field of behaviorism. In the same year, in 1953, the first code of ethics for psychologists was developed in the American Psychological Association. And we'll talk about ethics in a later module. And in 1957, Leon Festinger proposed a theory of cognitive dissonance and later became an influential figure in social psychology. I think cognitive dissonance is a term that everybody has heard. And it was in the 50s and 60s, up to the early 70s, that saw what psychologists call the cognitive revolution. And cognitive psychology took a mathematical and more methodical approach to see and study psychology and the human mind. The 50s and 60s also saw the managerial schools of marketing to rise as a separate domain of psychology and separate domain of economics. And in 1963, Milgram examined justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. Their defense often was based on obedience, that they were just following orders from their superiors. Milgram's obedience tests are legendary. Many of you have probably read about them and heard about them. There are many movies made of them, and many videos and books online to read about them. I urge everybody to delve into the Milgram experiments. It's fascinating stuff, and it's one of the cornerstones of social psychology. So now we're in the 60s, and in 1969, the Association for Consumer Research was founded. And that's the first association that strictly looked at consumer behavior. And in 1973, Zimbardo conducted the Stanford prison experiments, which gave rise to the book Lucifer Effect. This is probably something you've seen and heard before, and one of those Milgram things that I urge you to look online and check out what it is. It's been reproduced many times, and there are many movies and books written about it. Now that we're in the 70s, during the mid-70s, 3 of the modern schools of marketing were already established. So marketing management, consumer behavior, and then marketing exchange schools. And those were kind of the three main schools of thought that rose in the business literature in the 70s. And in 1974, the Journal of Consumer Research was established. And that was the journal to be published in when consumer research was concerned. In 1979, Daniel Kahneman and Hanken Tversky wrote Prospect Theory, an analysis of decision under risk that used cognitive psychology to explain various divergences in economic decision-making from neoclassical theory. Daniel Kahneman later won a Nobel Prize for his work, and he's the only non-economist who has ever won the Nobel Prize for economics. He's a psychologist by trade. And his landmark book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, I think should be mandatory reading for every single human being on the planet. And after that, we start seeing the rise of behavioral economics, which tries to marry economics and psychology. There are landmark books like Cass Sunstein's and Richard Thaler's Nudge, and we start seeing that universities build their own units for behavioral economics. So now you have a loose timeline for all different schools of psychology. You heard about philosophy, how that led to the rise of psychology, how clinical psychology and psychiatry aims to help people with mental disorders. Then you have social psychology, which with sociology looks at societal levels and groups of people and how interaction works. Then you have the rise of marketing theory, consumer research, and behavioral economics as well. So it's a good thing to know a little bit of every of these disciplines, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you make a new discovery or find a new research area. So go through all the material provided, and we'll continue this discussion online and in later courses. Thanks.